First, Mr. Chair, I want to submit for the record Senator Grassley's letter to the Department of Justice dated July 20th, 2017. I read a portion of that into the record during my opening statement.
Without objection.
Ambassador, congratulate you. You've been down in the secret deposition meeting rooms. You've graduated for your performance today. Later this afternoon, I should note that for the public that we will be back down in the basement of the Capitol doing more of these secret depositions. Ambassador, I don't really have very many questions for you. You admitted in your opening statement that you don't have any firsthand knowledge of the issues that we're looking into. But I do want to talk a little bit about Senator Grassley very briefly. I assume that you know who Senator Grassley is?
Yes, sir, I do.
Do you believe that Senator Grassley is a serious and credible elected official?
I have no reason to think otherwise.
Were you involved in the July 25th Trump-Zelensky phone call or preparations for the call?
No, I was not.
Were you involved in the deliberations about the pause in military sales to Ukraine as the Trump administration reviewed newly elected President Zelensky's commitment to corruption reforms?
For the delay in
For the pause.
the pause? No, I was not.
Were you involved in the proposed Trump-Zelensky, later Pence-Zelensky meetings in Warsaw, Poland on September 1st?
No, I was not.
Did you ever talk to President Trump in 2019?
No, I have not.
Mick Mulvaney?
No, I have not.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm not exactly sure what the ambassador is doing here today. This is the House Intelligence Committee that's now turned into the House Impeachment Committee. This seems more appropriate for the Subcommittee on Human Resources at the Foreign Affairs Committee. If there's issues with employment, disagreements with the administration, it would seem like this would be a more appropriate setting instead of an impeachment hearing where the ambassador is not a material fact witness to any of the accusations that are being hurled at the president for this impeachment inquiry. I have several questions I think Mr. Castor wants to get to. I know, Ms. Stefanik, you had a few quick questions for the ambassador. I'll yield to you, Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes. Ambassador Yovanovitch, thank you for being here today.
The gentlewoman will suspend.
What is the interruption for this time? It is our time.
The gentlewoman will suspend. You're not recognized. Mr. Nunes, you are minority counsel.
I just recognized.
Under the House Resolution 660, you are not allowed to yield time except to minority counsel.
The ranking member yielded time to another member of Congress.
No, that is not accurate.
You're gagging the young lady from New York?
Ambassador Yovanovitch, I want to thank you for being
Gentlewoman
here
will
today.
suspend. You're not recognized.
This is the 5th time you have interrupted members of Congress, duly elected members of Congress.
Gentlewoman will suspend.
Mr. Chair, we control the time. It's been customary of this committee that whoever controls the time can yield to whoever they wish. If we have members of Congress that have a few questions, it seems appropriate that we be able to let Ms. Stefanik ask her questions.
Mr. Nunes, you or minority counsel are recognized.
All right. Mr. Castor, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes. Ambassador, welcome. Thank you for your service. 33 years, an extraordinary career. It really has been a remarkable tenure for you at the State Department. I also would like to thank you for participating here today. This is a crazy environment. This hearing room is turned into a television studio. Before today, you spent on the Friday the 11th, you were with us for early in the morning until I believe it was 8 o'clock at night. People missed trains back to New York, and it was a very complete day, so thank you. You were serving a 3-year assignment in the Ukraine, is that correct?
Yes.
And it began in 2016 and was scheduled to end in 2019?
Yes, that's correct.
And nobody disputes that it's up to the president to decide who his envoys are to post around the world, correct?
I stated that clearly in my statement.
And you returned from Ukraine on May 20th, 2019?
That's correct.
And your return coincided with the inauguration of President Zelensky?
Yes,
And you remain employed by the State Department?
I do.
And after you returned to Washington, the Deputy Secretary, John Sullivan, asked you what you wanted to do next. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And then you met with the Director General, Ambassador Perez,
Yes, that's correct.
to identify a meaningful new assignment.
Yes,
And you now serve at Georgetown University as a fellow.
that's true.
And this is a rewarding position for you?
I'm very grateful to be in that position after what happened.
Today is the second big hearing for the Democrats' impeachment initiative. But we don't understand, or we do understand that you don't have a lot of facts and information relating to the part of this that we're investigating. And those are the events from May 20th up until September 11th, the release of the security assistance funds. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So you were not part of the delegation to the inauguration. That was the day you returned. You were not part of the Oval Office meeting May 23rd, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you were not part of the decision-making relating to whether there would be a White House meeting with President Zelensky?
That's correct.
And you were not a part of any decision-making in the lead-up to the July 25th call?
That's correct.
And you first learned about the call on September 25th, is that correct?
Well, I heard about the call, as I indicated in the first deposition, from Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent.
And what did he tell you about the call?
Well, as it turns out, it wasn't correct, but what I recall is that he said that President Trump had asked President Zelensky whether he could, help him out, and which I understood to be these investigations, and that President Zelensky had said that he is putting in a new prosecutor general, and that he doesn't control. I mean, this is approximately what he said. That person is an independent individual.
Okay, and you learned about that before the call was made public?
That's correct.
Likewise, you were not involved in any discussions surrounding the security sector assistance funds to Ukraine, that they were paused for about 55 days from July 18th to September 11th?
No discussions.
Okay. In your opening statement on page 9, you stated, although then and now I've always understood that I served at the pleasure of the president, I still find it difficult to comprehend that foreign and private interests were able to undermine U.S. interests in this way. Individuals who apparently felt stymied by our efforts to promote stated U.S. policy against corruption, that is to do the mission, were able to successfully conduct a campaign of disinformation against the sitting ambassador using unofficial back channels. Do you believe that President Trump was aiming to weaponize corruption in Ukraine by removing you?
I don't know that.
Okay. Do you believe your removal was part of some scheme to make it easier for elements of the Ukrainian establishment to do things counter to U.S. interests?
I think that's certainly what the Ukrainian establishment hoped. I think that in addition, there were Americans, these two individuals, who were working with Mayor Giuliani, Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman, who have recently been indicted by the Southern District of New York, who indicated that they wanted to change out the ambassador. I think they must have had some reason for that.
And do you think they were seeking a different type of ambassador that would allow them to achieve some of their objectives?
I don't know what other reason there would be.
Okay. Is Ambassador Taylor the type of person that would facilitate those objectives?
No,
So Ambassador Taylor is a man of high integrity,
absolutely.
and he's a good pick for the post?
He is. I would note that he is the charge out there, as of course you understand. So no ambassador has yet been, or no candidate has yet been named to the position.
But he certainly has had a decorated career serving his country.
Absolutely, a man of the highest integrity.
You testified about when you first learned that Mayor Giuliani and some of his associates had a concerted campaign against you. When did that first come to your attention?
We were picking up rumors from Ukrainians. I think, kind of in the November, December 2018 time period. But then in January, February, and of course, March, it became more obvious.
At some point, I believe you testified that Minister Avakov alerted you to this campaign?
Yes.
And when was that?
He had a conversation with me in February of 2019.
Okay. And do you remember what he related to you?
Yes, he said that Mr. Lutsenko was working with Mayor Giuliani through these two individuals, Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman, that they basically wanted to remove me from post, and that they were working on that.
And did you have any awareness at that point in time of precisely why they were seeking your ouster?
I didn't. I didn't understand that at all because I had never met Mr. Parnas and Mr. Fruman, and so it was unclear to me why they were interested in doing this.
Were you especially influential implementing policies that stymied their interests in Ukraine? Were advocating for some sort of environment or policies that would be adverse to them?
I think that just the general idea that obviously U.S. ambassadors, U.S. embassies, one of our most important functions is to facilitate U.S. business abroad, right? Whether it's trade, whether it's commerce, that's one of the things that we do. And but everything has to be above board. We believe in a level playing ground and so forth, but we obviously advocate for U.S. business. These two individuals, with hindsight and what we learned later, looking to open up a new energy company exporting liquefied natural gas to Ukraine, never actually came to the embassy, which is unusual because that would usually be a first stop. Going to the American Chamber of Commerce, going to the U.S. Embassy, get the lay of the land, see how we could provide assistance.
And was that source of frustration ever expressed to you, or did you just learn that separately?
Source of frustration? What do you mean? On whose part?
On Fruman and Parnas.
I don't know that they were frustrated. I mean,
Okay.
Frustrated by what?
Well, you mentioned that they had business interests, and I asked you whether they had been stymied by anything in particular that you had advocated for, or you were a roadblock to them being successful.
Yeah.
I wondered if there was any connection.
I'd never met them. When I heard those names for the first time, which was in February of 2019, I asked my team, the econ and the commercial sections are the ones who would usually meet with American businessmen and women, and nobody had heard of them. So all I can conclude is that it was the general U.S. policies that we were implementing. that might have been of concern to them.
Okay, and at any point, did you ever try to reach out to the Prosecutor General, Mr. Lutsenko, and find out why he was participating in this concerted campaign?
No,
And then why didn't you do that?
I didn't feel that there was any purpose to it.
Why not?
He is, he clearly had, I would say, an animus for doing this, and he was working with Americans. So I reached out to the American side, in this case, the State Department, to try and find out what was going on.
When did you first realize that your relationship with Lutsenko had reached a adversarial point?
Probably around that time, maybe a little bit earlier.
And this is March?
Yeah, and what I would say, adversarial, that's a really strong word. We at the U.S. Embassy are visiting key people from the State Department and other agencies. We were pushing the Ukrainians, including Mr. Lutsenko, to do what they said that they were going to do when Mr. Lutsenko entered office, that he was going to clean up the PGO and make reforms, that he was going to bring justice to the what they call the Heavenly Hundred, the people who died on the Maidan in 2014, the Revolution of Dignity, and he was going to prosecute cases to repatriate the approximately $40 billion it's believed that former President Yanukovych and his cronies fled the country with. And he didn't do any of that. And we, kept on trying to encourage him to do the right thing. That's what the Ukrainian people wanted him to do, and we thought it was a good plan and that he should do it.
And then you mentioned you contacted the State Department in late March. Was that Under Secretary Hale?
So contacted about what?
About the concerns you had about the campaign against you?
I contacted the State Department much earlier than that. I mean, it was an ongoing sort of discussion, makes it sound very formal. We have many ways of going back and forth with Washington. So, on phone calls or DVCs, we would have this discussion.
When did you realize this?
And if I could just amplify my answer, we had the discussion because we were concerned that Ukrainian policymakers, Ukrainian leaders were hearing that, I was going to be leaving, that, there was maybe somebody else waiting in the wings, et cetera. And that undermined not only my position, but our U.S. position. The Ukrainians didn't know what to think. And we need to be out there all the time, firing on all cylinders to promote our national security interests. So it was a concern.
And when did you realize this concerted campaign against you was a real threat?
A threat in...
A threat to your ability to do the job in Kyiv?
Well, I would say that when you go into a meeting with somebody and they ask, are you going to be leaving, that is concerning. So that probably, I don't know exactly when that started happening, but in that time frame.
And did you undertake any efforts to push back on this narrative, either inside the State Department or publicly?
Well, certainly with the Ukrainians, I said, there's nothing to this. This is, a distraction, and we are focused on the job. Our policy remains the same. Yes, we had discussions in the State Department about this.
In hindsight, do you think you did enough inside the State Department to alert them to this mounting campaign against you?
I did what I could.
And what was that?
Reached out to the European Bureau. I think you've also heard that Dr. Fiona Hill was aware of this as well, so the NSC, and they had other discussions with more senior people.
Okay. And did you get any feedback from your chain of command? I mean, did you engage Ambassador Rieker,
Yes.
Under Secretary Hale?
Yes.
And
yes.
Did you develop sort of a game plan to push back against these allegations?
So, I mean, there are different timeframes here that we're talking about. So, fast forwarding to March, I did, when Undersecretary Hale asked whether I would consider extending, I did raise, because I wasn't sure that he was aware of it. I wanted to make sure that he knew that Mayor Giuliani had been out there saying things about me, untrue things, and I wanted him to be aware of that. And he said, you know, he understood. He still was hoping that I could extend for another year. So that was early March, and then fast forward to late March, and the discussions about this issue continued. But obviously, once it became a public political story here in the United States, the tenor of everything changed, because I think that the State Department felt that it wasn't manageable anymore, and that the more prudent thing would be for me to come back in July.
Do you think there was anything you could have done differently to get ahead of the story and to lobby the secretary and his counselor, Mr. Breckbuell, that there was a concerted campaign against you, that you didn't believe the allegations lodged were accurate and you needed their assistance?
I think that, sure, maybe I could have done that, but I think they were aware. And as I subsequently learned from Deputy Secretary Sullivan, the Secretary of State had been well aware of this since the summer of 2018.
The corruption's endemic in the country of Ukraine, right?
I would say that corruption is a serious issue everywhere in the former Soviet Union. It's a post-Soviet legacy. And we talk about it a lot in Ukraine because there's actually an opportunity to do something, to actually help the Ukrainians tackle the issue. They want to tackle the issue. In other countries, like Russia, you can't even talk about it. So I think it's a post-Soviet legacy, and it's important to deal with it.
And that you testified rampant corruption has long permeated Ukraine's political and economic systems?
Yes, that's a fair statement.
And it's your belief that it should be the U.S. foreign policy to help Ukraine curb its corruption problem?
Yes, because it's good for the Ukrainians, but it's also in our interests.
And anti-corruption efforts, you mentioned, serve a national security purpose?
I believe that to be true.
Are oligarchs a big part of the problem in Ukraine?
Probably, because so much wealth is concentrated in the hands of a very, very few, 6 or 7 individuals, and they also have political power and control the media.
And a lot of their power has been acquired through what we here in the U.S. would consider improper ways?
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment.
The head of Burisma, Mr. Zochevsky, you familiar with him?
I don't know him, but I know who you're talking about.
George Kent testified a couple days ago that he was investigating for stealing millions and millions of dollars, some of which had been supplied by the U.S., Great Britain, subject to an investigation, trying to get the money back. That was a big part of Mr. Kent's initiatives when he was there. That a bribe was paid to the prosecutors, and Zochevsky was let off the hook. This was in 2014. Is this something that you're familiar with?
I've heard about it. This was before my arrival. And I would just say my understanding, but please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the U.S. money that you're referring to was the money that we used to fund an FBI team that was embedded with the Prosecutor General's office to go after, not to go after, but to do the investigation of Burisma and Zlochevsky.
Mr. Kent testified that this bribe was paid, the prosecution went away, and essentially nothing has been further done with regards to Burisma. During your tenure in Ukraine, Has there ever been any focus on re-examining allegations, whether it's at Burisma or other powerful interests like Zlochevsky, re-examining it?
Is that on the part of the Ukrainian government? Is that what you're
Yeah.
talking about?
Trying to lean on the various prosecutors general to clean up the oligarchical system?
I think, yes, there have been some efforts, and as I mentioned earlier in my testimony, the U.S. was welcoming of Mr. Lutsenko's nomination to the position of Prosecutor General, because we were hoping he would clean that up. That, in fact, is not what happened. And because, it's kind of hard to explain to a U.S. audience, but in Ukraine, in the former Soviet Union more broadly, including in Russia, the justice system, whether it's cops on the beat, whether it's investigators, whether it is prosecutors, whether it is judges, are used as a tool of the political system to be used against your political adversaries. And so I think that, going back to your question about Burisma and Zlochevsky, my understanding, this was, as I told you earlier in the previous deposition, this did not loom large when I arrived. I arrived in 2016, August 2016. But over time, my understanding was that the case was basically sort of on a pause, that it wasn't an active case, but it also was not fully closed. And that is a way, as I mentioned before, for those in power to keep a little hook in to Burisma and Mr. Zlochevsky.
And right around the time the bribe was paid, Burisma undertook an effort to spruce up their board, and they added, I believe, the president of Poland and some other luminaries. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I don't exactly know what the timing of all of this was.
Okay.
But yes, I mean, to the elements.
And, one of the folks they added to the board was the vice president's son, Hunter Biden, which, raises questions. Is he a genius on the corporate governance front? Is he a genius with the Ukrainian oligarchical systems and cleaning that up, or was he just added to the board because he's the vice president's son? Was that ever, a concern, or at least the perception of that concern addressed?
As I said, I arrived in August of 2016, several months before the elections and several months before President Trump took office. And it was not a focus of what I was doing in that 6-month period.
Okay. Was the issue ever raised at all?
Not.
He was still on the board, I think, at the time.
Yeah, my understanding from newspaper accounts is that he just recently left in 2019. I never met him, never talked to him. And I'm sorry, what was your question?
He was still on the board when you arrived at Post, and was just wondering if at least the perception problem was brought to your attention as the ambassador.
I was aware of it because, as I told you before, in the deposition, there had been in terms of the preparation for my Senate confirmation hearings for Ukraine, there was a question about that and a select answer. So I was aware of it.
Okay.
Yes.
In your deposition, you acknowledged that the president has longstanding concerns about corruption in Ukraine. Is that true?
That's what he says.
Well, going back to, there was a meeting with President Poroshenko in September of 2017 in the Oval Office, and I believe you testified that, he expressed his concerns then.
Yeah, he said that a friend of his had told him that Ukraine was the most corrupt country in the world.
Okay. Several witnesses have testified that the president has concerns that there are certain elements of the Ukrainian establishment that during 2016 were out to get him. Is that something you were aware of at any point in time?
Well, I'm certainly aware of it now. Obviously, there's been a lot of press attention on that. It was not brought to my attention during the 2.5 years that I served under President Trump as our ambassador to Ukraine.
We've gone through the deposition some of these elements that, maybe they loom larger now, but, in hindsight, was there any discussion at the embassy that there's these indications of some Ukrainians trying to, at least advocate against then candidate Trump?
Actually, there weren't. I mean, we didn't really see it that way.
And were you aware of, I know Mr. Nunes mentioned this earlier, the consultant Alexandra Chalupa had reportedly, at least according to her and according to Ken Vogel at the Politico, was trying to work with the Ukrainian embassy in D.C. to, trade information, share leads of that sort of thing?
I saw the article. I, didn't have any further information about that.
And did you see the article at the time, or did that only come to your attention subsequently?
It's certainly been brought to my attention subsequently. I think I did see something to that effect at the time as well.
And you're the ambassador in country at this point. Did you aim to get to the bottom of that? Because, if the reporting's true, if what Ms. Chalupa told Mr. Vogel is accurate, that would be concerning, correct?
Well, I was the ambassador in Ukraine starting in August of 2016. And what you're describing, if true, as you said, what you're describing took place in the United States. So if there were concerns about what Ms. Chalupa was doing, I think that would have been handled here.
And do you know Ms. Chalupa?
I don't believe so.
Have you ever met her?
I don't think so. I mean, if she worked for the Ukrainian embassy, it's possible that I met her in a large group or something, but I don't believe I know her.
Are you aware of the role that investigative journalist Mr. Lashenko played in publicizing the Manafort black ledgers?
Yes.
And he publicized some information in a pretty grand way in August of 2016, and almost immediately coincided with Mr. Manafort leaving the Trump campaign. Was there anything about that issue when it was occurring that concerned you?
Well, I certainly noticed it because I was, a week or so away from arriving in Ukraine. I think that from a Ukrainian perspective, I realize we are looking at this from an American perspective. From a Ukrainian perspective, I think that what Mr. Lashenko and others who were looking into the Black Ledger were most concerned about was actually not Mr. Manafort, but former President Yanukovych and his political party and the amount of money that they allegedly stole and where it went and so forth. I mean, I think there's just a difference in perspective depending on which country you're in.
But you can understand the president, at least from his perspective, looking at these facts, it certainly is reasonable to conclude that there are elements of the Ukrainian establishment that are advocating against them at this point in time, correct?
Well, just speaking about Mr. Lashenko, he's an investigative journalist, as you said, and he got access to the Black Ledger, and he published it, as I think journalists would do. And again, I'm not sure that I don't have any information to suggest that was targeting President Trump.
With the way the events unfolded, Mr. Manafort was, subsequently left the campaign, and it certainly did begin a period of interest in, Manafort's ties to Russia and so forth.
I think, again, I think that that may have been the effect here in the United States. And obviously, it was of interest to journalists and others here that Mr. Manafort was former President Yanukovych's political advisor, and he was the political advisor, head of a campaign here. And so we all know that there have been court cases and so forth where Mr. Manafort was found guilty of certain actions. But at the end of the day, President Trump won the elections.
With Mr. Lashenko's reporting, I mean, there's been a question of whether all the information that he published was authentic, correct?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
There's been some have questioned whether the information Mr. Lashenko published was all correct or whether it was doctored.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that.
Okay. You know, Ambassador Chali, during the August timeframe, he wrote an op-ed in The Hill taking issue with then candidate Trump. Were you aware of that when it occurred?
Yes.
And did you have any communications with the ambassador to express concerns?
No.
And how frequently did you communicate with the ambassador? Obviously, you're in different posts in different countries, but.
Yeah. Didn't actually see him or talk to him that
So
often.
you weren't in frequent communication?
No.
Can you see how, you know, writing an op-ed, even, you know, given the substance, you know, we've discussed the substance of it, that there's some sensitivities, but can you see how just the simple fact of writing an op-ed, the Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S., might create a perception that there are elements of the Ukrainian establishment that were advocating against then candidate Trump?
My recollection of that op-ed was that he was taking he was critical of a policy position that President Trump had with regard to Crimea and whether Crimea was, you know, a part of Ukraine or a part of Russia. That's a tremendously sensitive issue in Ukraine. And my recollection is that that is what Ambassador Chali was writing about.
And do you know whether the ambassador or anybody from the embassy tried to make contact with the Trump camp to talk about their concerns before lodging an op-ed?
I don't know.
Okay. You know, during the same time period of the run-up to the election, the Minister Avakov had said some especially candid things about then candidate Trump on some various social media platforms. Are you aware of that?
Yes, as a result of the deposition, okay. The previous deposition.
But during the relevant time period when it was happening, you weren't aware of that?
You know, I don't recall it.
Okay. He's one of the more influential officials in the Ukraine, correct?
He is.
And I believe he's one of the few that span both the Poroshenko administration and the Zelensky administration.
Yes, that's correct.
Looking back on his comments in hindsight, do you see how that might create a perception that a very influential Ukrainian was you know, advocating against then candidate Trump?
That he was doing what? I'm sorry?
Just advocating. He was out to get him. I mean, he said some real nasty things.
Well, you know, sometimes that happens on social media. And you know, are you asking me whether it's appropriate? Probably not. But I would say that Minister Avakov has been, as well as others, both in President Poroshenko's administration as well as in the Zelensky administration, has been a good partner to the United States. As I think I told you before, he's a very practical man and looking for partners and getting the job done.
I'm shocked that social media would be the site of negative comments. You certainly can understand that the president, aware of Minister Avakov's, you know, statements, aware of what Mr. Lashenko was up to, what Ambassador Chali was up to, and these other elements that we've discussed, that there certainly forms a reasonable basis to wonder whether there are influential, you know, elements of the Ukrainian establishment that were out to get the president.
You know, again, I mean, I can't speak for what President Trump thought or what others thought. I would just say that those elements that you've recited don't seem to me to be the Ukrainian, you know, kind of a plan or a plot of the Ukrainian government to work against President Trump or anyone else. I mean, they're isolated incidents. We all know, I'm coming to find out myself, that public life can be, people are critical. And that does not mean that someone is, or a government is undermining either a campaign or interfering in elections. And I would just remind again that our own U.S. intelligence community has conclusively determined that those who interfered in the election were in Russia.
You would turn our attention to Ambassador Volker. He's been a friend and colleague of yours for many years. Is that correct?
Yes, that's true.
And I believe you testified he's a man of honor.
I believe that to be true.
And a brilliant diplomat.
Yes.
And you have no reason to think that he would be undertaking any initiative that was counter to U.S. interests?
I think that he tried to do what he thought was right.
Turning our attention to the Trump administration's policy of aid, the aid package to Ukraine, you've testified that during your tenure as ambassador, America's policy actually got stronger toward Ukraine. Is that accurate?
With the provision of javelins to the Ukrainian military, yes, that was really positive.
And why was that important?
Well, two things. They are obviously tank busters, and so if the war with Russia all of a sudden accelerated in some way and tanks come over the horizon, javelins are a very serious weapon to deal with that. That's number one. But really the more important issue is the symbolism of it, that the United States is providing javelins to Ukraine. That makes Ukraine's adversaries think twice.
And the provision of javelins to Ukraine was blocked during the previous administration. Is that correct?
I think they made a determination. I was not a part of those discussions, but obviously they had not yet made a determination about whether to provide javelins.
But do you have any understanding of what the interagency consensus was with regard to javelins during the previous administration?
I think that most in the interagency wanted to provide javelins to Ukraine.
And so in the new administration under President Trump, the ability to afford Ukraine this weaponry is a significant advantage, significant step forward?
We thought it was important.
And has it played out that way?
Well, it has, because it's a symbol of our strong support for Ukraine. But when then, this year there are questions as to whether or not our security assistance is going to go through, that kind of undermines that strong message of support.
Ukraine still has the ability to acquire the javelins, though, correct?
Are you now talking about purchasing javelins? By the Ukrainian government?
Yeah.
Yeah, they do. That is my understanding.
The security sector assistance did go through. It was paused for 55 days from July 18th to September 11th, but it ultimately went through, correct?
It's my understanding.
Okay. You testified during your deposition that you were proud of the efforts of the United States during your tenure to supply this type of aid to Ukraine. Are you still happy with the decisions?
Are you talking about the javelin?
The javelin and also just the whole aid package.
Yes.
Do you think it's sufficient? Do you think we're giving Ukraine enough money?
That's a hard question because one can always use additional funding. That said, I think that that the Congress has been very generous in voting for security assistance and other forms of assistance for Ukraine.
time is coming to an end, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman.